In view of the current situation, after conducting an investigation, it has proven your properties can be attributed to the deliberate actions of the female suspect.
Look at her. This isn't an accident, it's a targeted attack. While the world watched, this HOA representative took a flamethrower to my life's work.
She smiled while my barn burned, not screamed, not panicked, not shocked. She just stood there at the edge of my property with her arms folded, watching orange flames swallow the old corn barn my grandfather built with his own hands. And when I ran toward the fire, desperate to save anything I could, she looked me in the eye and said, "You should have followed HOA rules." That was the moment I knew this wasn't an accident, and that was the moment she made the biggest mistake of her life, because she thought I was just a quiet old man living alone on inherited land beside her polished suburban neighbor. She had no idea was a federal judge, and by the time she found out, it was already too late. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 62 years old, widowed, and I live on 12 acres of family land just outside a growing town in North Carolina. My family has been on this land for over 100 years. My grandfather grew corn here. My father repaired tractors here. My wife Ellen planted sunflowers by the fence. Every spring until cancer took her 6 years ago, I stayed. Because this place still felt real. The barn wasn't beautiful to outsiders. It leaned a little. The paint had mostly faded. The boards were rough with age. But to me, it was part of my family. Inside were old tools, family records, letters, photographs, and memories you couldn't replace with money. To me, it was priceless. To Heather Wexley, president of the Willow Creek Estates, HOA, it was an eyesore. Willow Creek Estates appeared beside my land about 10 years ago. Before that, the property next to mine was open field. Then developers moved in. Within 2 years, the old farmland was gone. In its place came paved streets, identical houses, decorative ponds, stone mailboxes, and signs that promised luxury country living. That phrase always made me laugh. They wanted the look of the country without any of the actual country. No tractor noise, no smell of barns, no muddy tires, no old buildings, no history, and definitely no weathered corn barns standing beside their neat rows of expensive homes. That's when Heather came into my life. I met Heather on a Tuesday morning while I was fixing a fence. A white SUV pulled up near my gate, and out stepped a woman in spotless boots, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of smile people wear when they've already decided they're in charge. She looked around my land like she was inspecting a problem. Then she said, "You must be the owner." I leaned on the fence post and said, "Depends who's asking." She removed her sunglasses and gave me a practiced smile. "Heather Wexley, HOA president for Willow Creek Estates." I nodded once, then she pointed at my barn. "That structure is visible from our northern lots." I said nothing. She continued, "Several homeowners have complained." I looked at the barn, then back at her. "Then I guess several homeowners have eyes." Her smile tightened. That was the beginning. At first it was just letters, not legal letters. Just HOA nonsense dropped into my mailbox with serious-looking headers: notice of visual, known compliance, notice of adverse aesthetic condition, notice of property impact concern. Every message meant the same thing: paint the barn, hide the barn, fix the barn, remove the barn. I ignored all of them. Then Heather started showing up in person. She told me the barn lowered property values, she said. Future buyers didn't want to look at agricultural decay. She asked if I would sell part of my land so the HOA could plant trees and build a visual barrier. I told her no. Every single time. That should have been enough. But people like Heather don't hear no as an answer. They hear it as a challenge. The first real problem came over my tractor one Saturday morning. I was repairing an old John Deere near the barn when a county code officer pulled into my driveway. He looked embarrassed before he even got out of the truck. Mr. Harper, he said, we received a complaint about hazardous equipment storage. I looked at my tractor. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't leaking. It wasn't dangerous. It was just a tractor being repaired on private agricultural land. The code officer knew it. I knew it. Still, he had to inspect. While he was there, I noticed a white SUV parked down the road. Heather sat behind the wheel. Watching, the officer checked everything. Then finally said, "There's no violation." I nodded. Thought so. As he drove away, Heather did too. That was when I realized she wasn't just annoyed. She was trying to use the system against me. Then came the survey stakes. One morning, I found bright orange flags pushed into the ground near the back of my property. Close to the barn, I hadn't ordered any survey, so I called the county. They had no record of one. I walked the property line myself and found 2 workers measuring land and talking about fence. Placement, I asked. Who hired you? One of them checked his clipboard and said, Willow Creek Estates HOA. Stared at him. This is private property. He looked confused and suddenly nervous. Apparently, they had been told the land was being reviewed for some kind of easement connected to drainage work. That was a lie. I sent them away and took pictures of everything. An hour later, Heather called me. There may have been a misunderstanding, she said. No, I told her. There was trespassing, and I hung up. There's something you should know about me. I never liked announcing who I was. At the courthouse, everyone knew me as the Honorable Daniel Harper, United States District Judge. But out on my land, I was just Daniel. I didn't introduce myself with titles. I didn't mention my job to impress people. I didn't wear authority like a costume. Part of that was personal. I've spent enough years in court to know power should be used carefully, and part of it was simple. I liked being underestimated. Heather knew I had worked in government. That was all she assumed. I was some harmless retired official. She had no idea the man she kept harassing had spent 30 years hearing lies, studying evidence, and dealing with people who thought they were above the law. The barn mattered more than she could ever understand. It wasn't just an old building. Inside were crop journals handwritten by my grandfather in the 1930s. My father's letters from his army years. My wife Ellen's seed collection, old family ledgers. Faded photographs, 4-H ribbons from my daughter, and bits of history that existed nowhere else in the world after Ellen died. I had started sorting everything slowly. Some people inherit money. I inherited proof that ordinary people lived meaningful lives. Whenever I felt lost, I went into that barn and stood in the dust and quiet and remembered where I came from. So, every demand Heather made felt personal. She wasn't asking me to clean up wood and paint. She was trying to erase my family. The neighborhood slowly took sides. Not everyone. In Willow Creek was like Heather. Some waved when they drove past. Some bought sweet corn from me in the summer. A few, clearly, thought the HOA had gone too far, but most stayed silent. That's what happens in neighborhoods where one person controls the rules and the fines. Nobody wanted trouble. Nobody wanted Heather showing up at their door with violation notices and committee threats. Then one evening, a young mother named Teresa came to my gate with her little boy. She looked nervous. I thought you should know, she said quietly. Heather mentioned at the HOA meeting that if you wouldn't fix the barn, the county might eventually declare it a hazard. I asked what grounds she gave. Teresa shook her head. None. But she seemed excited. I thanked her as she was leaving. Her son looked at the barn and said, I think it's cool. I smiled. Kids usually see things more clearly than adults do. Then my warning signs disappeared. I had 3 posted signs near the barn. Private property. No trespassing. No. Open flames. One morning, all 3 were gone. Ripped clean off. That bothered me immediately. especially the no open flame sign. I've lived in the country long enough to respect fire. Old, dry wood. Summer heat, and one careless spark can destroy everything, so I replaced the signs and installed trail cameras, 2 near the barn, 1 at the gate. Simple. Motion-activated cameras. I didn't tell anyone. 3 days later, one of them captured Heather walking along the edge of my property with another woman from the HOA. They stood there pointing at the barn for several minutes. That alone wasn't a crime, but it told me something important. She was obsessed, and obsessed people eventually make mistakes. Then the lawyers. Letter arrived. It came on expensive paper with formal language meant to intimidate. The HOA claimed my barn, created visual blight, possible stormwater issues, and fire risks to nearby homes. They demanded I either renovate it to community compatible standards or remove it within 60 days. I actually laughed when I read it. Then I read it again more carefully. The arguments were weak, but they were building a paper trail. Not a winning legal case, just enough pressure to wear me down. I wrote a short response myself. I didn't use legal threats. I didn't mention my title. I simply stated the facts. My property was outside HOA authority. The barn was legal and pre-existing. Any trespass or interference would be documented. Then I mailed it. 3 days later, Heather drove by very slowly while I was checking the mailbox. She looked furious. That was when I knew she had expected me to fold. That summer turned brutally dry. By late July, the grass cracked under your boots. The pond level dropped. Even the air felt dry and sharp. I checked the barn every morning. No electrical issues. No dangerous storage. No loose wiring I cleared brush from. Around the outside and kept hoses ready. Fire was always my biggest concern around that same time. Heather started sending neighborhood emails about rural fire hazards and unsafe and adjacent land use. I only saw them because Teresa forwarded them to me. One sentence in particular stayed with me. If local authorities won't act, communities must protect themselves. That line bothered me because people who think they're the hero can justify almost anything, and people like Heather always see themselves as the hero. The night before the fire was strangely quiet. No wind, no barking dogs, very little traffic. I remember because I sat on my porch until almost 10 o'clock, drinking iced tea and listening to cicadas. The barn stood dark against the moonlight, familiar and steady, before going to bed. I checked the camera feeds on my laptop. Nothing unusual, eh? A raccoon, a pair of deer, a delivery van turning around near the road at 2:17 in the morning. I woke up to the smell. Smoke. Not distant smoke. Close. Smoke. Wrong smoke. I threw on my boots and ran outside. The east side of the barn was already burning. Flames climbed the boards so fast that I knew instantly this wasn't an accident. This fire had started from the outside. Someone had set it on purpose. I tried to save it anyway. Instinct takes over before logic does. I grabbed the hose and turned it on full blast. I sprayed the lower boards and tried to keep the flames from spreading, but the fire had too much of a head start. The wood was dry. The heat was intense. The flames moved fast. I shouted for help even though I lived alone. Then I called 911. As I moved around the side of the barn, I saw fresh tire tracks in the grass near the property edge and through the smoke and the firelight. I saw someone standing near the road, still watching as I got closer. Headlights from an approaching car lit up her face. Heather, she didn't run, she didn't hide, she just stood there, with her arms folded, watching my barn burn. Then she said, "You should have followed HOA rules." I will never forget how calm her voice was. That calm was colder than the fire. The firefighters arrived quickly, but old barns burn fast. By the time they got the flames under control, half the roof had collapsed inside. Everything was gone. The shelves were gone, the chests were burned, the tools were twisted, the records were soaked, blackened, or destroyed. Decades of family history lay buried in ash and water. I stood there in smoke-soaked clothes. Staring at the remains, a deputy came over and started asking questions. When did I first notice the fire? Had I seen anyone near the property? Were there any electrical problems? Any disputes with neighbors? I looked past him toward the road. Heather was gone. I said, yes, there have been disputes. Then I gave him her name. By sunrise, arson investigators were on the scene. They studied the burn pattern, photographed the outside wall, and collected samples from the ground. One of them found melted plastic near the east side of the barn, probably from a fuel container. The fire had started low and outside, exactly where I believed it had intentional. The investigator asked if I had cameras. That question cut through everything, yes. I said, we went inside my house and reviewed the footage. Gate camera showed a white SUV stopping near my property at 1:48 a.m. Another camera captured two figures moving near the barn with flashlights. 1. Had Heather's exact build and haircut. Then came a burst of light, then fire. The investigator looked at me and asked, that your neighbor? Yes, and the other one. I stared at the screen. Not yet, I said. But I had a feeling we'd know soon enough. By noon. The whole neighborhood knew. Smoke always spreads. News, faster than gossip. People gathered near the road pretending concern while trying to get a better look. Some were honestly upset. Some were curious. Some looked scared. Teresa brought me coffee and pastries I never touched. Heard Heather was here last night, she said. Quietly she was. Teresa looked pale. Then she told me something. Important? After a recent HOA board meeting? She had overheard Heather laughing on the clubhouse patio with two board members. Heather had said, that barn will be gone before fall. One way or another, Teresa hadn't reported it, because she thought it was just ugly talk. Told her to call the deputy and make a statement. She did. That was Heather's second big mistake. She believed everyone around her would stay silent forever. The second person in the footage turned out to be Ryan Bell. Ryan was the HOA vice president. He was a real estate agent with a polished smile and absolutely no backbone. Investigators matched his truck on a traffic camera nearby. Then they matched his phone location to the area around my property that night. Once deputies brought him in, he folded fast. According to Ryan, Heather told him they were going out there to document fire risk conditions. Around my barn, she brought a gas can and claimed it was for brush clearing, which made no sense then, according to Ryan. Heather splashed fuel along the outside wall. He panicked. She told him to stop being dramatic. Then she lit a piece of paper with a grill lighter and tossed it at the base of the barn when the flames rose higher than expected. Ryan wanted to leave. Heather stood there watching for several seconds before she finally turned away. That part I believed immediately. Heather denied everything, of course she did, by that afternoon. She had hired an attorney and sent out a message through the HOA email list. She called the accusations false and defamatory. She claimed she had only driven out late that night because she noticed suspicious activity near my property. She said Ryan was lying to protect himself. She suggested my old barn might have caught fire because I failed to maintain it. She even described herself as a concerned neighboring landowner. But facts are stubborn. There was video there. Was phone data. There were witness statements. There was arson evidence. And then there was one more thing. A fourth. Camera mounted high in the trees and harder too. Notice, that camera captured Heather's face clearly as she poured the fuel. Once investigators saw that footage, the case went from strong to crushing. That should have been the end of it. Arrest, charges, public disgrace. But Heather wasn't done. 2 days after she was arrested and released on bond, she filed a civil lawsuit against me. She claimed I had defamed her, damaged her reputation, and used my social position to influence law enforcement. At that point, she still didn't know what my actual position was. She thought I was some retired official with local connections. The lawsuit demanded money, public retraction, and an end to what she called my harassment. I read the complaint at my kitchen table beside a half-burned family photograph salvaged from the barn. Then I picked up the phone and called an old friend, Martin Keene, one of the best litigators I had ever known. And unlike me, Martin enjoyed a good courtroom battle. Martin showed up carrying 2 briefcases and wearing the expression of a man who had already decided someone was about to regret their choices. He stepped into my kitchen, looked at the charred boxes stacked by the wall, and his face changed. I heard it was bad, he said. It was worse, I answered. We walked the property together. He studied the remains of the barn, the tire marks, the camera locations, and every detail that mattered back inside. I handed him Heather's complaint. He read the first page and gave a short laugh. This is either arrogance or stupidity. With her, I said, it's both. Then Martin asked me something important. How much do you want to reveal? He meant my title, my role, my position. I thought about it for a moment and said, not unless it becomes necessary. He nodded. He understood justice should not depend on dramatic introductions. But if either wanted to drag me into court while lying under oath, she was going to learn exactly who she had picked a fight with. We filed a countersuit, not for revenge. For the truth, Martin responded with claims for trespass, property destruction, emotional distress, and conspiracy related to the HOA's repeated interference with my land. We also demanded preservation of all HOA records connected to me or my property over the previous 2 years, emails, texts, meeting notes, legal communications, internal messages that demand caused panic inside Willow Creek, because once lawyers start preserving records, people suddenly remember what they should never have written down. Within 2 days, 1 HOA board member resigned. Another hired separate counsel. Then anonymous screenshots started arriving in Martin's inbox from someone inside the neighborhood. Heather's texts, Heather's emails, Heather's messages to board members and Ryan. She had called me that stubborn hillbilly, the barn troll, and a relic sitting on valuable dirt. Then came the line that mattered most. Once it's gone, he'll have no choice but to sell. That gave us motive, clear and ugly. The criminal case moved fast. Arson is serious, especially when a structure fire could spread to nearby homes and land. Ryan, Bell agreed to cooperate. Heather did not. She rejected every chance to admit what she had done. At her preliminary hearing, she arrived wearing a cream-colored suit and the expression of someone insulted by consequences. Her lawyer tried to present Ryan as unstable, me as hostile, and the evidence is mostly circumstantial. Then the prosecutor played the hidden camera footage. The courtroom went silent. There she was, Heather Wexley, pouring fuel along the wall of my barn. Her bracelet caught the light. Her face turned just enough to make denial ridiculous. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not shame, not regret, fear. And in that moment, I knew the truth had finally caught up to her. Then she found out who. It was not from me, from the prosecutor. After the hearing, Heather was outside the courthouse arguing loudly with her attorney. She saw me standing with Martin near the steps and marched toward us before her lawyer could stop her. This is not over, she snapped. You have no idea what I can still do. The prosecutor had just stepped outside behind us. He looked at her and said, very calmly, Miss Wexley, threatening a federal judge in public, is an exceptionally bad strategy. Everything stopped. Heather blinked. A what? Martin adjusted his glasses and said, "You didn't know?" The color drained from her face so quickly, it almost looked unreal. For the first time, she looked at me with something beyond anger. It was the realization that the quiet man she had mocked, trespassed against, and sued knew the law better than anyone she had ever tried to bully. I looked at her and said only one thing: you should have respected boundaries. Then I turned and walked away. Her panic spread through the whole HOA. The following week was chaos. Residents demanded emergency meetings. Board members blamed each other. The HOA's insurance company sent investigators. Their lawyer told everyone to stay quiet, which almost nobody managed to do. Once the neighborhood learned I was a federal judge, the social atmosphere changed overnight. Not because I asked for special treatment, but because suddenly everyone understood this had never been some silly neighborhood disagreement. This was criminal harassment, property destruction, and legal disaster aimed at someone fully capable of understanding every consequence. Started receiving awkward apologies. People who had ignored me for years now wanted to tell me they had always liked the barn. One man actually brought over a pie and said, "We didn't know." I thanked him, but I thought about something. I did not say out loud, "You didn't need to know my title to know what was wrong." The HOA records were even uglier than I expected. Through discovery, Martin uncovered months of coordinated pressure. Heather had pushed the board to file nuisance complaints with no real basis. She urged members to contact county offices over and over until someone responded. She discussed possible access points onto my property. She even suggested that because I was older and widowed, I might be easier to pressure into selling. That line made. Martin closed the file and stared at the wall for a long moment. Then he opened it again and kept reading. There were also notes about launching a community petition based on exaggerated claims that my barn posed an immediate danger. Some board members objected. Those objections helped them later, but nobody truly stopped her. That's how people like Heather operate. Not because they are stronger than everyone else, because they are tolerated. One afternoon, I went into the ruins alone. By then, everyone around me was focused on court dates, evidence, and strategy. But legal victories don't bring burned memories back. I put on gloves and a mask and stepped through what was left of the barn. I found warped hinges my grandfather had made by hand, a scorched tin from Ellen's seed collection, an old coffee can full of nails my father had sorted decades earlier. And then, near a collapsed shelf, I found the metal frame of a photograph. The picture inside was damaged, but still visible. It was me and Ellen, younger, smiling, covered in dust after repainting part of the barn one summer. I sat down on a broken beam right there in the ashes and cried. Not because of Heather, not because of court, because destruction hurts most where memory lives, and memory was what she had. Really tried to burn away. The prosecutor offered Heather a plea deal. It would have reduced her exposure if she admitted guilt, paid restitution, and permanently stepped down from all HOA leadership. She refused, her attorney later suggested. She was too emotional to make a clear decision. I didn't believe that. I believed she simply could not stand admitting. She had lost control, so the criminal case moved toward trial. At the same time, her civil lawsuit against me started to fall apart. Her lawyer tried to narrow the claims. Then he tried to delay hearings. Then he tried to quietly withdraw certain parts. Martin opposed every delay at one hearing. The judge asked Heather's attorney whether his client truly intended to proceed. In good faith, given the criminal evidence already on the record, the attorney answered with careful legal language. The judge replied, "That was not my question. It told me all I needed to know." When the criminal trial started, the courtroom was full. Neighbors, reporters, county staff, curious residents. People who had ignored the whole situation before were suddenly very interested now. Ryan Bell took the stand first. He looked terrible. His collar was damp with sweat. His hands shook. His voice was thin and dry, but he told the story. He described Heather's obsession with my property. He described the pressure campaigns, the insults, the threats, and her fixation on forcing me to sell. Then he described the night of the fire, the gas can, the grill lighter, the fuel on the wall, the flames rising too. Fast, Heather stared at him with pure hatred. Then came the text messages. Then came Teresa's testimony about the phrase one way or another. Then came the camera footage. By that point, it was no longer a question of whether. Heather had done it. The only question left was how long she intended to keep pretending she hadn't. Against her lawyer's advice, Heather took the stand. That decision destroyed her at first. She sounded calm and polished. She described herself as a hard-working volunteer, trying to protect community standards. She said Ryan had misled her. She said the video was misleading. She said she only had the gas can because she wanted to document fire hazards. Nothing she said made sense. Then the prosecutor began his cross-examination. He took her step by step through every complaint, every email, every text, every false claim. When he showed her the message, once it's gone, we'll have no choice but to sell. She said she meant legal removal. When he showed her, nature might, she claimed it was sarcasm. Then he played the video of her lighting the paper. He looked at her and asked, "Ms. Wexley, is it your testimony that this fire somehow started itself immediately after you poured accelerant and lit material at the base of a wooden barn?" The courtroom went still. She actually said yes. That was the moment she lost the jury. Completely, the verdict came quickly. Guilty, arson, criminal, trespass, property destruction, and the related charges tied to the danger of the fire spreading. Heather sat frozen when the verdict was read. Ryan later received a reduced sentence because of his cooperation. Heather was not so fortunate at sentencing. The judge spoke clearly and directly. He said this was not an accident. It was deliberate. Destruction fueled by entitlement and a complete disregard for the law. He also noted something important. He said, "The emotional and historical value of what was destroyed mattered, not just the market value of the building. I appreciated that more than, if I can explain. The law does not always speak well about grief, but sometimes the right judge finds the right words." Heather was sentenced to prison, ordered to pay restitution, and placed under strict conditions afterward. As deputies led her away, she looked at me once. Not with regret, just disbelief, as if consequences still felt unfair to her. The civil case ended. Piece by piece after that, once Heather was convicted, her lawsuit against me became impossible to maintain. It was dismissed. Our countersuit moved forward. Heather's personal finances were not enough to cover all the damage. The HOA's insurance company fought coverage, claiming her criminal acts were outside any protected responsibility. That started another legal battle. Martin handled it with visible joy. Evidence showed the HOA board had encouraged and enabled pressure campaigns against me, even if not all of them knew about the arson plan itself. Eventually, the HOA agreed to settle. They paid for reconstruction of the barn, restoration of the property, attorney fees, emotional damages, and archival recovery work for the family records. But I insisted on one more thing, a formal public acknowledgement, not hidden, not sealed, not buried. Every resident in Willow Creek had to receive a written statement admitting the HOA had acted wrongfully toward me and had exceeded its authority. If they wanted peace, truth had to be part of the price. That letter changed the neighborhood more than the conviction did. Criminal verdicts feel dramatic, but written truth, delivered quietly to every mailbox, settles deeper at each resident received. A notice stating that the HOA leadership had unlawfully targeted a neighboring landowner and failed to stop escalating misconduct by its own president. People couldn't dismiss that as gossip. They had to face what had happened. Several board members resigned. The management company was replaced. New rules were created to limit unchecked authority, require transparency, and restrict the HOA from launching personal campaigns under the excuse of community standards. Teresa was elected to the new board. That pleased me more than I expected. The first time she came by afterward, she laughed nervously and said, "I promise not to regulate your corn." I told her that was probably a very good decision. For the first time in years, Willow Creek felt less hostile. Not warm, but humbled. And humility is often the first step toward decency. Rebuilding the barn was harder than I thought it would be. Not because of money, because of emotion. Every new board, every fresh beam, every clean nail each. One felt like a repair and a reminder at the same time. The builders did excellent work. They used old photos, where they could. They preserved original hardware when it was safe. They rebuilt the shape and footprint almost exactly. But no rebuilding can make old wood old again. No replacement chest can hold the exact fingerprints of the people who used it before. Still, I kept going, because rebuilding is a form of refusal. It means cruelty does not get the final word. I worked with the crew whenever I could. I hauled boards, sorted salvage, and chose which burned pieces would remain visible in a small display inside the restored barn. One carpenter asked why I wanted to keep damaged items on display. I told him, "'Cause healing that hides every scar is just another kind of lie." He nodded. I think he understood. The media wanted a bigger story. They always do. By then, local headlines were everywhere. HOA president convicted after barn fire, victim revealed as federal judge. Neighborhood. Feud ends in prison. Some national outlets even reached out because people love stories where arrogance collides with hidden authority. But that was never the real story to me. So when reporters asked if I enjoyed the moment Heather found out who I was, I gave them the truth. "No," I said. I wish she had behaved lawfully when she thought I was powerless. That quote spread farther than I expected. Maybe because it touched the real heart of the matter. Respect that only appears after status is revealed is not real respect. It's fear. And fear is not morality. I did one final interview beside the rebuilding barn after that. I declined the rest. Some stories belong on the land where they started. After sentencing, I went to visit Ellen's grave. I brought sunflowers. The same kind she used to plant by the fence every spring. I told her everything out. Loud the fire, the trial, the lawsuit, the rebuilding. Then I laughed a little and said, "You would have hated that woman." That part felt true. Ellen had no patience for bullies dressed in expensive clothes. When I finished talking, I stood there in the quiet and thought about what life really requires from us. Maintenance of land, of memory, of dignity, of boundaries. Sometimes courage doesn't look dramatic. Sometimes it just looks like refusing to move when someone tries to erase what matters. On the drive home, felt lighter than I had in months. Not healed, but steadier. And sometimes steady is enough. A few months later, Heather wrote me a letter from prison. I almost threw it away unopened. But curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 3 pages long and very carefully written. What stood out wasn't what she admitted. It was what she still refused to admit she said she had. It's been under extreme stress. She said the neighborhood expected too much from her, she said. Ryan should have stopped her. She said seeing my property every day made her feel trapped in decline. Trapped in decline. That was her phrase. As if my barn had harmed her just by existing. Near the end, she wrote, "Had I known who you were, I would have handled things differently." That was the only fully honest sentence in the letter. I never replied. There was nothing useful left to say. The restored barn was completed the following spring. I don't mean opened like a business, I mean finished. Standing, whole, alive again. The grass had come. Look around it. The doors swung properly. The red paint glowed in the sunlight without looking too bright. Inside, I had new shelves for restored records, sealed storage for recovered photographs, and a workbench partly made from salvaged wood from the original frame. I invited a few people over that afternoon, Teresa, and her son Martin, the fire investigator. 2 builders, the deputy who responded that night. We drank lemonade and kept things simple. Teresa's son looked around and said, "It still looks cool." I told him that was the best review any building could receive. When everyone left, I stood in the doorway and looked up at the rafters. The barn wasn't exactly what it had been before, but it was honest, and honesty was enough. Over time, people in the neighborhood started telling me the truth. Not all at once. One by one, They admitted they had seen warning signs in Heather long before the fire. Petty retaliation, selective enforcement, threats at meetings, public humiliation of neighbors who disagreed with her, but most had stayed quiet because they didn't want conflict. They wanted peace. Property values, comfort, that's the excuse people usually make when they choose safety over principle. I listened without pretending it was all fine. One man told me, "We never thought she'd go that far." I answered, "People rarely jump straight to arson. There are always earlier steps." He looked down and said nothing. That's the truth. By the time someone does something shocking, there has usually been a long period where smaller wrongs were tolerated. That lesson matters far beyond one neighborhood. My daughter came to visit that summer. She lives in Colorado and works in environmental policy. She inherited her mother's stubbornness and my habit of arguing with paperwork. She had followed everything from afar and wanted to come sooner. But I told her to wait until things settled. When she finally stepped into the rebuilt barn, she ran her hand over one of the salvaged beams and started to cry. Then I started to cry too. Then we both pretended we weren't crying, which is apparently how adults behave. She found one of her old 4-H ribbons in a restored archive box and held it up with a laugh. "It smells like smoke," she said. "It probably always will," I told her. She looked around the barn and said, "Mom would be proud you didn't let them take it." That hit me hard, because beneath all the hearings and lawsuits and headlines, that was the real story. Not letting them take it. Not the land, not the memory. Not the right to remain. People still ask me if I saw warning signs. The answer is yes. Of course I did. But warning signs are easy to excuse when they arrive as pettiness instead of open violence. A rude comment, a threatening letter, a false complaint, a small trespass, a social campaign. Each one seems too minor to imagine ending in flames. That is why documentation matters. That is why boundaries matter. That is why bullies depend on everyone else treating bad. Its behavior is normal for just a little too long. If I hadn't installed cameras, if Teresa hadn't spoken up, if Ryan hadn't cracked, if records hadn't been preserved, Heather might have gotten away with it. She would have called it unfortunate. The HOA would have called it regrettable. And the truth would have vanished with the smoke. People think justice begins in court. Often, it begins much earlier. With noticing, with writing things down, with refusing to be intimidated. I never used my robe to win this fight, and that matters to me. Yes, my title became public. Yes, it changed how some people behaved. Yes, made others much more careful. But the case itself did not depend on special privilege. It depended on evidence. That distinction is important, because if the law works only for people with status, then it isn't really law. It's theater. Heather burned my barn when she believed I was just an ordinary man with no power, and in the ways that mattered most. I was a husband who lost his wife, a son protecting family land, a neighbor defending his boundary, a citizen relying on facts. That should have been enough from the start. It should be enough for anyone. People sometimes ask what happened to Heather. In the end, she served her sentence. Her house in Willow Creek was sold during the financial collapse that followed the case. The HOA wanted distance from her name. Most of the people who once supported her disappeared. That is usually what happens when status is the only thing holding friendships together. I later heard she tried to move to another state. Maybe she did. Maybe she now tells a different version of this story, one where she was misunderstood or betrayed. People who cannot face themselves often become experts at rewriting their own history. That part, no longer concerns me. My barn stands again. My land remains mine. My family records, at least the ones that survived, are preserved more carefully now than ever before. And every time I walk through that doorway, I remember something simple. Destruction can be deliberate, but so can endurance. If there's one thing to take from all of this, it's this. The most dangerous people are not always the obvious villains. Sometimes they are polished, organized, and socially admired. The committee leader, the neighborhood enforcer, the person who mistakes preference for authority and control for virtue. People like that count on silence. They count on appearances. They count on others being too tired, too polite, or too afraid to push back. Heather Wexley thought my old corn barn was a problem she could erase. She thought fire would solve what arrogance had started. She thought a lawsuit would frighten me into silence. And she thought power only mattered. When it belonged to her, she was wrong. The barn was rebuilt. The truth came out. The law did its work. And the woman who smiled, while my family history burned, learned far too late that the quiet man she underestimated had spent his whole life making sure people like her answered for what they had done.